All right, good to go.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much, Marcelo. And as you said very well, we are very good friends, and I'm very, very happy to be part of this event. I hope you survive the 10-hour marathon. It's quite remarkable what you are about to do. So all my strength and my congratulations. The installation looks just fantastic. I wish I could see it personally. And yeah, so what I discussed with Marcelo is I have a very long presentation. So what is better is that I start talking and Marcelo will interrupt me to pick up on topics that he thinks it will be interesting to develop further. And yeah, so I will share a screen and we start. I think, yeah, I have the permission, right? Yes, okay. Good. So institutions, and I added a question mark at the end because I woke up today a bit skeptical. I'm feeling tired somehow. So I've been always trying to work within institutions, aiming for certain institutional change, because I still believe that the institutions are extremely relevant. But in many ways, I've also found moments in which I've have the feeling that my work, trying to be kind of having an active position within the institution, trying to change existing structures, was actually sustaining or legitimizing the institutions that otherwise perhaps will become obsolete. And yeah, I think perhaps this is something that I would like to discuss with Marcelo and with all of you. What are your thoughts about that? So that's why the question mark. And I want to tell you why. So it's a bit chronological to see how my thinking about institutions and my engagement came to being. So I started thinking when I was in New York. I was studying at Columbia University, where actually I met Marcelo as well. We were colleagues at the master's. And I was interested in new paradigms for cultural institutions, and in particular, museums that were circulating museums, mobile and temporary structures that were, in my opinion, at least that was my thesis at the time, and also the core of my PhD thesis, that was the result of a kind of populist attempt to connect to larger questions of democracy, because that was the year 2011, and obviously the effects of the economic crisis of the 2007 and 2008 were widespread. And there was a lot of tensions in relation to what it constitutes a democratic institution, from the government but to other, including the cultural ones, and how people can actually participate in those structures. So these two institutions that I looked at the moment, that were the Centre Pompidou Mobile and the BMW Guggenheim Lab, were looking or attempting to bring the museum to places where generally it wouldn't be, and to audiences that they wouldn't reach otherwise. And by doing that, they were, having other imaginaries about what a museum could be, where it is a, traveling structure or a circus, playful structures that will make people interested in culture. And my whole thesis was to understand what actually are the institutional borders that are created nevertheless, even though that the museum is not anymore that big building with white walls and, making its presence very, and its authority very evident. And what I found interesting is that as these institutions were traveling and were opening, many disputes happened. So it was not without friction that these new paradigms were unfolding. And this is, for instance, the opening of the BMW Guggenheim Lab in Berlin. And I personally always like very much this image that this woman says, we don't need New York to teach us how to talk. So this tension between institutions that on the one hand, aim to bring new ideas to population, and how population many times say, hey, we don't need you. We are perfectly fine self-organizing, and we don't need an international high-end institution to tell us what to do. And this is also in New York. When the lab opened, there were claims about gentrification, or how these events or these institutions are, on the one hand, appropriating topics that have been generally organized or dealt with more activist networks, community organized events. And what I also found interesting, and I'm part of that, is the ability of these institutions to actually incorporate that and absorb these questions into their own programming, onto their own themes. So the day after this protest happened in the New York BMW Guggenheim Lab, there was an event talking about the protest in the BMW Guggenheim Lab. So it's a question of also, on the one hand, obviously, having an open conversation, but at the same time absorbing the very critical voices that are against the institutions. And I mean, I guess that's what happened to me, because I was very critical in my thesis and my understanding of institutions and the institutional borders that are created. But funny enough, when I graduated, I was offered very generously to be a director of programming of a new type of institution within Columbia University that was Studio X. And there was this idea of a new type of university where is responding to the hegemony of the campus of the university, and trying to imagine another structure with centers around the world where people from different backgrounds, different cities can share ideas and share knowledge with different nodes of this network. So yeah, this was created by Mark Wigley. By the time he was the dean of the School of Architecture, and I was extremely lucky, but it was also very confronting, because in a way, many topics that I was discussing as a student doing my thesis, I had to face them as a professional dealing with this institution. And I learned that you have to compromise many things while working within institutions, even though that you have still a critical mind. So I just, this is a map at the time when I arrived that was how these different nodes of this network of sharing knowledge were operating. And during my time in the Studio X, we opened places like Shenzhen, Johannesburg, and Istanbul, the spaces. Most of these spaces are being closed now, sadly. Although I think that many, many interesting things happened. But one of my first and maybe naive attempts was to kind of challenge this map, this understanding of the nodes of the network as connected through territorial ideas, especially the idea of the map, this particular map of the world that privileges certain spaces and not others. So again, this might be a small attempt just to show what things I was trying. So we created this other map in which there is the nodes are not connected to a particular territory, but are almost floating in a network of communication. And the only kind of marker of their position is the time zone in which they are operating. Because at the end of the day, that was marking our conversation, our collaboration. How come we can discuss among us when some people is in Tokyo and other ones are in New York and in between? So that was my experience for a couple of years, and perhaps we can discuss later about it. But after my time in the Studio X, or during, together with my friends and colleagues, Carlos, Alejandra, Ignacio, and Luis, we applied to the Oslo Architecture Triennial. And we were lucky enough to win the open call. So we were doing this triennial, was something that we haven't done before. So we also imagined what could be an institution like that is temporary, that you have 3 years to construct an institutional space that then will last only for a few months. And we were really ambitious. We made many mistakes, but I am still very proud of many things that we accomplished. And we wanted to kind of touch upon many of the structures around which these institutions of the biennials are organized, and kind of thinking about what could be that will stay when the biennial will go.
Marina,
So
may
different
I
things.
may I do just a short It's just going to be, well, we figure out how to do this without sounding interruption. Uh, just because I see that someone, Luisa, raised their hand, and maybe that's a good way to maybe hear from someone else to ask the first question, and then we can follow up, because I think there's also a shift from the first two projects and kind of settings into what the Oslo Triennale will be, and maybe we can elaborate on that. But Luisa, if you want to unmute yourself uh, and ask your question or comment.
Yes, thanks a lot. I hope you can hear me properly.
Yes.
I was wondering how you define institutions. Like, it sounds to me that you talk about institutions as an organization. But yeah, I was just wondering. Thank
Yeah,
you.
that's a very good question. So I understand institutions as forms of organization of society that are organized around certain principles or common goals or common understandings of certain ideas. But for instance, my work is very much connected to cultural institutions, where they are museums or other forms of cultural institutions that are not necessarily as permanent as a museum might look like, but temporary ones as well. And that they have a constellation of people working together towards a particular understanding of society, a particular understanding of the world and their mission. But obviously, when you think about the institutions, marriage is an institution, and many other things are an institution. And I'm not going to go so deep into that, but my interest also in institutions was that it was a paradigm that was transforming these understandings of the main institutions that were organized in society. And we have seen how, institutions are like, again, family or marriage or many other things have been transformed a lot during the last decades, and understood them in under different ideas of gender, or different ideas of relations between patriarchy, or so I could not go too much into that because that was my realm of expertise. But indeed, cultural and architectural driven institutions it is. So my aim was bigger, but I was focusing on some of them. But indeed, like, institutions for me is this kind of collective forms. And well, obviously people like Foucault has been, one of the key figures that has been permeating my research, and that of many other people in looking into institutional thinking and also institutional critique that has been happening, yeah, through like so many decades already.
And maybe there is where I will just jump into, as we move on to as to the Oslo Architecture Triennale that I was lucky to see in person. Um, I think there is it, and maybe you just elaborate on this as you continue. But will the Oslo Triennale be a little bit more an institutional critique rather than an extension of the previous projects? If we think about Studio X, Studio X was a global network, so global could mean kind of generous, but also kind of taking over, right? So will the Oslo as a kind of form of temporary institution appeal to that as a kind of thought maybe that you can elaborate as you continue presenting?
Yeah, so indeed, because in a way we had quite a lot of freedom to organize that space, or as Pelin saying, and that infrastructure differently. Whereas in other cases in which I've been working, my role was to intervene in the institution under certain, frameworks. In this case, it was quite an advanced, I will say, attempt to rethink the role of universities in the future, and also maybe criticizing the hierarchy or constructed hierarchy around the US-based and Ivy League institutions in relation to the knowledge that is produced in the rest of the world. But for instance, in Oslo, we're like our canvas that's imagine what a biennial will be, and we didn't have necessarily to follow any particular structure. So we put there many of our dreams and obsessions. And as I said, some things went better than others. And the image that you are seeing is the main exhibition. And in that sense, we were interested in, finding ways in which the projects will enter in conversation between each other. And in that sense, not showing very well the limits between one project and the other to bring conversations. Obviously, that kind of curatorial and spatial architectural decision also drove to a lot of questions, because for the audience was not that clear to understand which project was which one, and for some of the participants it was a bit frustrating that you will confound and merge the sound of one and the image of the other. But for us that was beautiful, no? To lose somehow the authorship and to create a discourse that goes beyond independent and individual presentations. So that was one of the things, but there were others. So rethinking the role of the exhibition as well. Then we all did an open call because obviously we were Oslo Architecture Triennial, so there was a presence of a particular territory, but we were thinking that Oslo is not necessarily only present in Norway and in the city of Oslo, but there are other constructions of Oslo that are present in many other ways, like, for instance, the Pakistani community that has been migrating to Norway, in particular certain neighborhoods in the city of Oslo in Norway. They have also, they have a particular space that is called Little Karachi, but the same ones, they have also another area in Pakistan that is also connected to all the people that have been living in Norway, and it's also like a little Norway. So in that sense, we were thinking Oslo is happening in Norway, but it's also happening in Pakistan and in many others. And the conditions that we wanted to bring together and analyze were happening in Norway, but also many other spaces that we thought that was impossible to understand these global conditions without having different situated practices. So that's why the Oslo Triennial was happening in Oslo, in Kirkenes, in Stockholm, in Copenhagen, in Lagos, Prato, Dubai, New York, Risaralda, etc. So for us, was kind of a counter narrative of the more nationalist approach that many times biennials have, kind of a form of production of tourist allure and attraction to a particular territory. We wanted to decentralize in a way that idea of triennial as a destination for tourism or just a way of marketing for the city. The other aspect was education. We wanted to obviously, the Oslo Architecture Triennial was looking into questions of belonging in a moment where, when we were working on the theme, was the so-called refugee crisis that obviously continues and has been there for many years, but in that moment was very present in the press everywhere. And we wanted to think about how architecture can deal with questions of belonging in general. And we invited students from many different universities around the world to come to discuss and in what we call the academy. Because for us it was important that there will be these discourses that will be happening also in a school, and that could inform future methodologies and other forms of education, and also future practices within architecture. So that kind of melting pot where many people were discussing, and it was very interesting because it was not without conflict and without friction. And so the academy is also something that has stayed, and at least until now. In the next editions of the Oslo Architecture Triennial, the organization has been continuing doing this academy. And there are other initiatives, but perhaps this one is quite remarkable as well, is the project that Jonas Stahl did with the communities of Rojava, and it was a temporary embassy for the communities of Rojava. And obviously was celebrating the notions through cultural means of the stateless democracy. So if we think about belonging, many times we associate it, for instance, with forms of national identity or the territorial boundaries or national histories. And in this case, we wanted to emphasize other forms of belonging that are constructed, for instance, with ecofeminist approach as well, that the Kurdish communities of Rojava have. And what was interesting is that it was created inside the Oslo City Hall. So in that sense, thinking about the institutions, how a formal institution of a state like a city hall that has so much history like the one in Oslo can host an embassy for a stateless community and a stateless mode of policy and democracy. And it was very moving, beautiful gathering, very political moment. But what was for me more important is how under the guise, perhaps of the biennial, the triennial, we were able to organize a very politicized event that perhaps wouldn't have been happening without that understanding that we were doing something culturally. But obviously when it happened, it stopped being nothing to do with a triennial. It had its own life, and it was understood as actually a real official representation of the communities of Rojava in Oslo, which, by the way, was opened by the mayor in Oslo. So a state like Norway was having an official embassy of Rojava in their city hall of their capital, which again was a cultural practice, but it was much more than that at the end, like questions of representation. And for me, this idea of how to use your certain opportunities and as Pelen was saying, the infrastructure itself of the institutions to counter its logics or to find loopholes to operate within them is interesting. In that sense, it's not my, merit. It's all to the communities of Rojava and Jonas Stahl who work together in making this happen, of course. And yeah, after that, I moved to a big, more bureaucratic institution called Het Nieuw Institute in Rotterdam. That was the former NIE, National Institution of Architects. And my role was to be director of the newly formed research department. And it was, okay, the question that I was asked is what it means to be doing research within a museum. And this is me. Also an image of, drawing of one of the events with Chus Martinez. And I was claiming like my first idea was reading and taking time as a form of research, like what it means to read the world around you and what a museum could be. So that has been the question that I've been looking at for the last 6 years that I've been here. I'm very happy that we have a new director that is Arik Chen, and I'm sure it's gonna continue being exciting work under his direction. But some of the questions that I think are important that kind of lead the notions that we are addressing at the Institute and also counter certain institutional logics is that we see the exhibition as something that is alive, and it's not only the representation of something that has happened and then we materialize it in a fixed stage, but are things that are evolving. And many times our research starts with an exhibition. So it's not something finished to present to society, but it's something in which everyone participates in creating. And I'm not talking about a form of participation, it's more conceptual, but in a way as well. So we don't mind showing the back end or the processes that happen behind the institutional work we do. Actually, we put it in the front and we discuss them as well. We also discuss questions about extraction, how our own practices have to do with questions of ecology, how the production of exhibitions and the material that is completely used or used in the exhibition in itself are also entering these forms of production and consumption. And the questions of value, how as an institution you create value to certain objects, to certain practices, how by highlighting certain, elements or names and so on, you are sustaining a construction of a system of value, and what is our responsibility in that. And finally, the role of the visitor. We understand not as a passive visitor, but many times we are a bit cynical because we work with notions of visitor as consumer. That is very much how it is portrayed in many institutions. So what it means when the visitor enters, how it engages with the spaces of the institution, what type of comforts and discomforts these bodies experience, and what is the type of identity that people who enters in the institution is embodying like what it is, as I said, as a form of consumption or leisure or labor or just, you know, a form of spectacle. Since the beginning, as I said, was questioning what a museum could be, what research could be, but more important, what institutions could be. And we did several projects about burnout, in a way, highlighting the destructive and violent nature of many institutional practices, something that we are seeing today, but it's not new. You know that racism, sexism, forms of patriarchy, hierarchy, etc., are very at the core of what an institution is. And now we're inspecting their foundations and analyzing if it is possible actually to regenerate certain notions of the institution, actually amend or repair the practices and non-exploitative, non-racist notions of the institution, or if actually we should create new ones. And as my dear friend and colleague Amal Allah told me, isn't it very, in a way, snobbish to think that you can create new institutions and that you wouldn't have or make the same mistakes that institutions that have like centuries of existence have done. So my question is always, do we sustain existing institutions and try to make them better? Or should we kind of let them fail and create new ones? And most of the times I am inclined to sustain them because I see how much funding or histories like resources these institutions have. And maybe I always dream that it's possible to redirect these resources and energies somewhere else. But I have a lot of doubts about that claim. One of the questions of the institution is the collection. We have one of the biggest collections of architecture and urban planning, but it's the national collection. So it's Dutch architecture and urban planning. And what is striking about this collection is really rich, has amazing, jewels, as you will say, but is more than 98% of the documents we have are authored by men, white men. So our question is, okay, how to amend? What if, someone in 50 years time would like to see what, architecture and art means and what should be there that represents society and what it means to collect, what do we collect, and what are the means by which that are even more democratized means of collecting that doesn't need certain expertise. So we have done a lot of what we call at the beginning archive explorations, because when we started, it was still not possible to say that we were actually making interventions, because national collections are difficult spaces that touch many different sensibilities, and you cannot just say that you want to transform them, because there are many people who are extremely proud of them and they feel very, very identified with the content and the ethos that they represent. But we wanted to acknowledge the questions like feminisms in architecture, queer in the collection, squatting the archive, and also acknowledging the gaps in historiography, the gaps of certain agents that are not present, questions about colonialism and the post-colonial thinking as well in the collection. So just one quick example was the attempt that we did to include the squatting practices in the collection. And that was very different reasons. Squatting was legal in the Netherlands until 2010, also connected in a way to the economic crisis, and was tolerated in a way that people will occupy buildings that were empty for more than a year. We thought that was an attempt also for us to tackle on the housing crisis and questions on vacancy and the right of housing that many times we forget. But also it was an understanding of practicing architecture by non-experts, thinking about the spatial practices that are relevant for the city and for society, and that perhaps should be in the National Archive, and that not necessarily are done by people who have a degree. And finally, collective and even criminalized practices, and how that you can include them in a collection that depends and is paid by the state. So how communities that are criminalized by the states are included in a museum and in a collection that depends on the state. So what is there? And we have many conversations about that. What are the reasons behind doing this project? And I know that is controversial, but I'm still behind the project. What we did is working only with existing squads and working with the communities very closely in understanding the spatial practices that we're doing. We developed some drawings with students of architecture that then were annotated by these communities in sessions that we had together, sometimes individually, sometimes in groups. And then this more normalized, normative language of architecture was complemented by these other, oral histories and annotations that were giving another layers of information about the type of living practices, spatial practices, and forms of coexistence that were happening in those spaces. And these are the documents that somehow entered the collection and were collected with obviously the permission of the squatters and their support.
Marina, before you continue with this project, mostly because I'm very interested in this one, as a kind of form of, as you just mentioned, right? Your role was to create a framework to, first of all, engage with the squatters in an act of defying and supporting the questions of property and the institution of property, particularly housing, as a questioning of housing not as a human right, but as a property and a commodity. But that this project, what it's doing really, it's creating new documents to enter a collection, and in great part, I think there is something very interesting there about your previous sort of struggle with how much we sustain the institution or how much we reject it or dismantle. And I wanted to kind of raise that a little bit, because I think that's a crucial question, and a question that I think this event is greatly invested in. The reason that we're seeing the installation in the kind of neoclassical axial sort of scheme of the university campus is precisely to kind of really occupy the space of the institution and kind of subvert and kind of engage with it in order to expand its opportunities and capacities, departing from the kind of resources that the institution, the formal institution, have. So I'm not sure if I have a specific or a straight question to that, but I think that this is maybe super important to understand that this is happening within the context of property and building and housing, right? And so there's a kind of a strong connection to a space as something that is being practiced, right? Is produced. It's precisely, as I'm sure we'll hear later from Helene, about social relations, right? And that is actually what constructs space. And for me, this is an opportunity to I'll maybe try to make emphasis about this comment throughout the date. It's about the outside, right? And about how we create spaces that are outside the norms of institutions. In a way, we are a little institution, all of us, right? We carry passports, we carry IDs. If we don't carry them, we are not considered institutional enough to be considered human or so. So I think that the notion that this is creating temporary spaces or even transitioning onto other forms outside the institutionalization of life in the kind of traditional way, right? Not the kind of reinventing the institution. I think this project really elaborate in that. So I think if I don't know if as you continue presenting this one, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about the nature of how housing and property exist in the Netherlands as opposed to perhaps the United States, where the dominant regime is of course the regime of capital and extraction, and housing is one of those that is completely suffer from it.
Yeah, indeed. And I think it's super important, and maybe that summarizes at least my take about institutions. I think, okay, the reason why we wanted to start this project was to being able to think beyond the general the notions that we have about affordable housing, or ideas of housing, that they never, or most of the times, reconsider questions of property. And, you know, I'm not talking about any form of squatting. I'm talking about the Dutch one that was, as I said, legal or tolerated until 2010. Then we enter a period in which it was illegal, but still people can occupy, and they cannot be evicted until they have a court case in which a judge says that, and that delays the process in which people can still stay. Well, I think a few weeks ago that has changed. So you can see rapidly now they can be evicted within 72 hours without a court case. So we have seen a project that was very much not trying to think about the squatting as something historicized, but something contemporary that many people were doing, and in our conversations with these communities, because they didn't have access to another, you know, housing situation, but others because of principles or because they really like the space of collectivity that was created in those spaces. So the reasons why these spaces exist are varied. So we have seen at the beginning all the spaces that we looked at were contemporary. Well, this was 2015. We have been working with them continuously. Most of these spaces have disappeared already. And in the span of these 5-6 years, now the law has changed again. My aim, maybe a bit naive, was to have the support of the, you know, National Institution of Architecture to be able to intercede in that debate. So in fact, we send a lot of letters to support certain communities in court cases. The reasons why we have these drawings were because many times real estate developers go to the court case saying we have to evict these people because we have these plans that for the redevelopment of this area, we are going to do a shopping mall or we are doing a housing. And then they convince the judges that, you know, that is going to happen. That never happens most of the time or takes so much time. So we wanted to also to have other like, okay, this is how people is living. This is how over time, these communities have improving the conditions even of this property, etc. So did we succeed? No, I think there were some court cases that were giving us hope because in some occasions the judges ruled in favor of the squatter communities because they saw that the right of housing was more important in that case. But my aim was to have also a larger, you know, even to see if we can change the law again. And that didn't happen. In fact, has gone even worse.
Right.
What's happened is that, you know, architects looked into much more this type of forms of spatial practice, and it was recognized in certain words, the work of, you know, these communities, but that's not enough for me. And second, kind of this idea of infiltrating the collection, but then we go to what we say. How can I, just with a project or a few collections of women architects, counter the logics of an archive that in 98% of it has other logics that has been accumulating for, you know, hundreds of years. So yeah, you can amend certain, you can start conversations, but my point was that this archive has a kind of a budget of many millions a year, and that is supported by the state, and therefore all people who pay taxes in the Netherlands. So therefore it's common in many ways, it's public, and therefore has to acknowledge that architectural practices are done by many people, not only like star architects. And I think that that in a way is the reason why we wanted to challenge that logic, but also my doubts is like, how come it's just such a small interventions in a larger, so wouldn't it be better to create another platform? But how do you, if this is the public one that receives the support of all of us, then how do you sustain the other one? So I'm always in that in between. Still, I'm committed in a way to to bring those questions to the archive. And many people will say, well, you are also institutionalizing a practice that is an activist practice. Why on earth you would like to bring and institutionalize those practices? Sorry, these days everyone becomes a kind of a doorman, and so I apologize for that. I'm just gonna ignore it.
That's okay. We
So
have birds
yeah,
in the background.
many conversations about that actually. And I have to say, we did it in collaboration with the communities. They all supported being in the archive. They feel proud of being considered in that collection. And more importantly, they also created their own archive. So we didn't took from them their own documents. We created new documents with them, and their official historical documents remain with the their own collections, autonomous collections.
Yeah, I don't know if you have, yeah.
No, just like maybe this one I really like, that thinking about the spatial practices is how, in this case, in the Port Cabal, there were a architectural idea of creating mezzanines, and it was not only connected to having more space for people living there, but it was a legal strategy because they multiplied the square meters of the property. And by doing that, they prevented the eviction. And actually they still are there. Why? Because the law says that in order to evict these people, you have to bring or give them another space with the same amount of square meters. And obviously by multiplying them almost by double, it was impossible to get such a big space. So actually, they are still there. There are some of the few existing communities of the ones that we worked with. And this is the book that we did after with kind of thinking about the methodology and how appropriate it is to do this project, a lot of reflections. And we produced it also with print, squatters, prints, and General is the ones who create the pamphlets. And it's the money that we get from the sales goes to court cases or supporting squatters. And it's also publicly available, complete in PDF. So you will look for it, you will be able to download it and use it. So that was one, but now we are also interested in questions of ecology and thinking about how the institution can, account for the many. And yeah, we are in this trend now of more than human, which I think many times is also problematic because it seems to obscure struggles that are connected to race or gender and so on, just by trying to think about this posthumanism. But we try to acknowledge all these questions in this project, and thinking about the institution. How can it be more like an ecosystem and be vulnerable and permeable for other understandings of the world? And I mean, this is quite a thing, because having like Earth or something living in the institution that you have an archive is already a nightmare, but I'm not gonna go there. So we are trying to do projects, that pilot projects that are also thinking about other institutions. So using the big institution to kind of do applied research and pilot possible institutions that eventually could take over and destroy the former, like the mother institutions and so on. And this is the ZOP, for instance, is a project that tries to have a non-human representation in the decision-making project of that institution, so ecological institutions. And we are testing it in 16 places around the world now. With a long collaboration, also understanding the legal consequences of having such a institution has non-human representation, but still through human bodies, which is complicated. And the institute itself has become this infrastructure, this testing ground on how to, manage an institution thinking through other notions.
Marina, if you could, I know you could, yeah, or maybe you can just, let's say, wrap up a little bit with this. I know this is kind of a very recent project, and I want to go back a little bit to that previous image on the.
Yes, this is just to say that we are also thinking about the practices that happen within the institution, that many times institutions are thinking about projecting, notions to the outside and promoting certain ideas. but many times these ideas are not necessarily followed within the institution. So the institution are extremely also bureaucratic and violent spaces that are driven by overwork, forms of precarity, racism, etc. And we try to work in a way that we acknowledge that, and when we talk about any issue, to how that land in the institution itself and can transform the institution. This is Lithium is a project about energy and the ongoing search of energy by humanity to kind of keep on going, keep the system going despite the ecological disaster and crisis, and actually our own burnout of the bodies. So we question what it means to search for energy continuously, and obviously we are thinking about new economies connected to this kind of green transition and the effects they have in the landscape, and yeah, many other questions. But yeah, let's keep it here because in a way, I just wanted to finish with this, like how these questions are also connected to questions of race, and in particular in the Netherlands, institutions have been very much at the core of criticism because of not acknowledging their colonial, connections, and has been, as in many other places, but especially here as well, the debate of racism and the colonial past forms of the participation of these institutions in slavery, etc., had been very prominent. And only now these questions are being translated into programs and forms of practice within the institution, where many other people that generally don't feel welcome as people from Rotterdam, that is one of the most diverse places in Europe, hasn't been addressed before. So now it's something that is very much at the core of the work that we do.
Yeah, I think it's, I'll just jump in. I think that that last image, as well as the previous one that you were showing about kind of using the pond outside the new institute, but also just the one that was there before. I think I think we have some background noise, which is not the birds, but um, I very much like to kind of wrap up a little bit with this image and the ones that you see it, because there is something here. There is something here about using the institution, right, and using the space of the institution to kind of actively construct the spaces that are producing, I will say, not just social relations, but also producing certain forms of life or forms of event. And so it, in a way, is not used to kind of display or passively display. And although things may seem, I would say, they may seem very simple or even basic to many who participate in shaping institutions, in formulating institutions, in maintaining institutions, but I don't think it's always necessarily the case. And what is the role of institutions in kind of allowing itself to erode a little bit of its own past and kind of complicit relations, as you said, for example, right, with the Dutch colonialism project and so on. So I very much like to just kind of raise this point of for us in here, the where we are and what we do in the spaces that we occupy is precisely an opportunity for not just reproducing the institution that we are in, but actually just reshape it, reimagine it. And I think that is, I think, what is valuable about extremely valuable about your work in kind of challenging the institution from within and questioning, as well as kind of trying to produce those temporary spaces for new ones. If there is anyone else that has any other comments, either here or online, please maybe just jump in or raise your hand. I will be happy to pass it along. There was a question earlier about the controversy of the squatting project, about what was it or why was it controversial. Could you?
I think there's goes two ways. On the one hand, people might think, like-minded people might think, hey, if you're a your critical mind, why then you are bringing non-institutional practices that exist outside the system in a way, or in the margins of the system, precisely to the core of the system. And doesn't it create a fragility, actually, and more vulnerability by having, these practices surrounded by normalized, legalized practices around them, no? But for me, it was important as a kind of a strategy of infiltration. And actually that project that was quite difficult to do, I have to say. I'm not meaning because of the outside, but within having the institution agree to do such a thing, opened many doors. And now the collection is thought in a completely different way. The possibilities of what should be in that collection has been, expanding. But at the same time, there were people to say, hey, why an institution that has public money has to spend, and literally their budget in supporting people who is smoking weed and having beers, and why that is considered architecture, why it is considered relevant? Who are you to claim that this community is important, what they are doing? How do you legitimize their place in history? Don't you think it's anecdotal? Do you think it's like, what we are doing is just like really unimportant for the larger history of the Netherlands? So these two things happen together. And what you have to do is to have a position as well. And that's perhaps is what I'm trying to say. Like, again, thinking about the topic of the event today, the public and commons, I know the difficulties, but perhaps I say, if this institution is public, with all the difficulties of what something public means and for whom is public, how can I make it more open? How can I include more people in benefiting from this infrastructure? And in that sense, for this a large amount of budget that we receive, how I can also redistribute it in places that perhaps wouldn't never receive public funding and nevertheless participate in the construction of the commons. So that is the logic that under which I operate. Is like, and then someone could say, and that you think you are the magician or the good girl that takes the money from the state and redistribute it to those that are not represented in that idea. Well, that's my naivety, and sometimes I try to do that, and many others, as I said at the beginning, I believe, well, actually what I'm doing is legitimizing that these institutions still exist, and they are not, being changed in a more radical way. But that's what I've done until now. Who knows where life takes me in the next years.
I think I will, I know we're overlapping with, Pelin will be here, but it's already here. But I think there was a good question by Kyle Gage on the chat that was, if the pandemic caused you to reevaluate the importance of institutions and how individuals interact with them. And I think that was a kind of a good question to kind of wrap up this session before we jump on with Pelin.
I think definitely, and I cannot hide my disappointment. I think that the institutions, how to say it without offending anyone. So I'm not talking about any institution in particularly with which I work, because actually I work with quite a few. But what I noticed is that there was a more need for care, for really supporting people in a non-efficient way, non-under bureaucratic logics and deadlines and paperwork that are really alienating. So everyone felt very fragile, and my work was to try to navigate between this machinery of the institutions and the bureaucratic thing that was nevertheless working and didn't got affected by the pandemic. Was not necessarily so. And the need to take care of people who works at an institution or people who you want to involve in projects and so on. And it proved extremely difficult. And I found myself many times thinking, I'm subjecting people to the logics of the institutional space in a moment that they are extremely dangerous and violent. And even though that the institution tries, and I've seen many attempts to account for more spaces of care and so on, the very structures of the institutions, how they operate, for being accountant to the public, you know, and transparency, very clear processes, objective processes, very kind of factual ways of measuring their impact. All that, in my opinion, goes against the idea of the commons. And this tension for me sometimes is unbearable. And actually, I wrote a text for eFlags talking about that I have, that I didn't want to go back to the office, that I realized that was quite a very uncomfortable space. And the funny thing is that I haven't gone back. I've been on leave for already 3 months, and made me think. So I think many things are going to change. And I think I'm not the only one thinking in those terms. The question is that we are able to change those bureaucratic systems, or we just have to find other ways to get together.
Thank you. I think that's beautiful, and we will do some in the class, in person. And it was beautiful because we're trying to, right, with this project, and even though we are in a kind of slightly different space from creating that space, but also it's to kind of maybe we need to reconsider also how we think about the spaces that we use, and we are kind of right now literally alternative using a space that has never been used as such. So thank you so much, Marina.
Thank you, Marcelo, and to all of you. And I stay here to listen to Pelin, of course. Looking forward, and good luck for the day.
Thank you. So